teacher of mindfulness and insight meditation, but Sharon has a special place in my heart because she's the first of sort of the big, well-known teachers who was willing to come do a day long at InsightLA when really we just had that little sitting group, and that was a great gift and help. And then, well, in March, Stephen Batchelor, old wonderful friend and author, is coming. But anyway, you can check in with Akemi or Edward or Angela, who is here doing the YouTube, and Edward, who is going to stand up any minute now. Well, his hand stood up, so thank you, Edward. If you need help with anything like the website or anything. So this morning I wanted to speak a little bit about some of the balance between humility and confidence in our perception. And I got inspired to do this by Jan, who is my friend from Boston. Jan Suri is a pioneer in women's psychology from the Wellesley Stone Center years ago, the last century, with Jean Baker Miller and other colleagues, and also is a teacher of insight dialogue now, but mainly she's a dear friend to me for decades, and we've been through lots of ups and downs on our journeys, respective journeys together. And her husband has just written a book. He wrote his first book his first book about being a resident at a big teaching hospital in Boston was called House of God, and he's written a sequel called Man's Fourth Best Hospital, which is really all about sort of what's happened to medicine today. And so they're a very accomplished couple who once wrote a book called We Have to Talk, about communication in couples, in which they coined the term, which I really have always loved. And it's for when, like, your partner says to you, we have to talk. And the term is relational dread. And so, anyway, I've appreciated their work for many years. And yesterday, Jan taught a workshop for our teacher group on giving and receiving constructive feedback. Now, this is something that actually we should do one that's for everybody, because most of us did not learn really skillful ways of giving and receiving feedback in our families. I had relatively nice family, but still, feedback was often given in a little bit of a critical, shaming, or blaming way. Not intentionally, but that's definitely how it came across. And kids, we're sensitive as children, and we receive these things, and then they stay with us. And then when someone says, I have to talk to you, we go into dread. Anyway, so Jan was speaking about this topic and having us do some learning about it and practice with each other yesterday. And she brought up these two qualities that are really necessary to give and receive this, when we need to talk to each other about something that could be difficult. Humility and confidence, that combination. And I think these are really important for our meditation practice, for our mindfulness practice, our spiritual practice, whatever practice you do or hold dear in your life. And to understand that these things that we all carry that cause us to have moments, if not years, of relational dread, depending on how severe the traumas are that we carry with us, or what we sometimes call the core wounds that we each have. I don't know how many of you get our newsletter or read the little blog, but I talked about one of mine in it last week. And one of my patterns, long-standing, has been to avoid writing, which I don't need to write. If you're a real writer, you need to write. You just want to write, and you write. But I have always felt very fulfilled by other things, much simpler things. Like yesterday, I took Jan, we walked down to the beach, and it was kind of cloudy. There wasn't much of a sunset, but it was very subtle, beautiful colors when it did turn all pink. And the tide was coming in. So there was that, it had been way out. So the tide flat, where the sky is reflected in the shininess of no water, but the sand is wet. And then it all starts flowing back in. I mean, it was really beautiful. And I feel utterly fulfilled by experiences like that, and not any need to write about it or write a book. And but when you sit up here and teach, people sort of expect you to. I mean, at one point, about, I don't know, 15 years ago, a mentor said, "Well, just write it because it's like a calling card." And I thought, that's a lot of work to put into a calling card. Like, I would have to feel, do you know what I mean? Something more compelling than that for a reason to do it. So anyway, I talked about deciding to do it because George Mumford, who many of you know, he's come here and taught a lot, and hopefully will be back soon. And George, who's a dear friend also for many, many years, it took him a long time to write his book, and when he did, of course, he couldn't wait to say to me, "So, when are you going to write your book?" Right? And I explained to him why I don't need to do that, and he just looked at me and said, "Don't you want your grandchildren to know what you stood for in this life?" Now, most of you are not grandparents yet, but when you are, you will understand. That was like the thing. Anyway, so now I'm going to write a book. And my target audience is my grandchildren when they're grown up. So I don't feel too much pressure, especially since one of them is not even 2 yet. But having the confidence to work with our patterns, because my pattern was very long-standing of avoiding that, and it wasn't all because I'm just so fulfilled doing other things and swimming in the beauty of life all the time. It was also because I knew that when I wrote a book, I would not be happy with it. I would compare it unfavorably to my friends' books. I would not be proud of it. I would wish that nobody would ever read it, and I would feel horrible when nobody ever does read it. Do you know what I mean? Just all of that stuff that we carry with us around our patterns. And it takes humility to be willing to acknowledge our vulnerabilities and our places where we avoid the mind zones or no-fly zones where we just don't go because we might get hurt, or it might step on one of our vulnerable toes. It takes confidence. It takes humility to acknowledge our vulnerability. I don't know about you, the last thing I want to be usually is vulnerable. But then it also takes confidence to be able to be vulnerable and know that it's okay, that it's really the best, actually. Because then we're not defending and warding off and protecting and being vigilant and wary, and, we can just relax. And Jan read a beautiful quote yesterday about this from Alice Walker, where she says, "I've learned the futility of expecting anyone, including ourselves, to be perfect. People who go about seeking to change the world, to diminish suffering, to demonstrate any kind of enlightenment, are often just as flawed as anybody else, sometimes more so. But it is the awareness of having faults, I think, and the knowledge that this links us to everyone on earth, that opens us to courage and compassion, to humility and confidence. It occurs to me that often many of those I deeply love are flawed. They might actually have said or done some of the mean things I've felt, heard, read about, or feared. But it's the struggle with the flaw, surprisingly endearing, and the going on anyhow. That's what I cherish about them." I wonder if she means her struggle with their flaws, with accepting her own and theirs, or the people's struggles, because not everybody's struggling with their flaws. You might have noticed that. They're more struggling to offload them onto you. Um, presenting, let's see. We perceive our own imperfect nakedness this way, but also paradoxically, the wholeness, the rightness of it. In the collective vulnerability of presence, we learn not to be afraid. And that's what we're doing here together. When we meditate together, maybe you don't feel so vulnerable because other people can't read your mind while you're meditating. Thank goodness. And so they don't know what you're thinking. It's not going to be, like a crawl line around the walls. Whatever. Can you imagine if our thoughts were all broadcast around the walls and we could see them? It would be kind of a beautiful art installation, as long as it didn't say who was thinking what. Um, so we feel protected by the stillness and the silence, but we are actually opening to all of who we are when we meditate, because you may have noticed you're not exactly in charge of what comes up and what emerges. You might want to be, and you might direct your mind in that way, but other things will just appear and make themselves known, and some are more welcome than others to be known. And so it's a vulnerable situation to sit with ourselves quietly like that, without somebody giving instructions every moment telling you what to do. But to just be like that. It's a vulnerable thing, because what do we see? Well, we usually do see our shortcomings and our flaws. And can we learn to give ourselves kind feedback when we see them? This is a big question, just internally. Can we give and receive mindful and caring feedback when we do perceive our flaws? And due to the negativity bias of our brains, which are oriented toward anything that might be a danger or a threat to us, we will notice the bad things, the scary things. We will give those more attention. Sharon Salzberg tells a story of when her first book came out, and people were just heaping praise on her book. And then one reviewer didn't like it. And I forget the word. There was a particular word they used that just got under her skin. And she talked about how, in the face of all this wonderful attention, that one thing tormented her. And that's, our brains are wired to do that. It's not just because we're depressed or something. And that's why the Buddha gave an instruction. He said, contemplate your goodness. And you wouldn't think that's what you're supposed to do, but he wasn't saying be all braggy and conceited. He was really meaning, look at the things you have accomplished. Look at the mountains you've already climbed, not just the ones you still have in front of you. Look around and appreciate what you've done in your life. Because that appreciation, it loosens the grip of all that criticism and judgmentalness. And if there's one single theme, after working with thousands of people in therapy and meditation retreats in all kinds of contexts, it would be how hard people are on themselves, how hard we are on ourselves. And you've done the same, and I'm sure you've discovered the same, Jan. So this humility and confidence, and I'll just tell you a story, because when I put out the word that I wanted people to come to show up to this workshop, because it was so important for our organization, for InsightLA. I think it's important for any organization. Have you noticed what groups of humans are like when they get together to work together? Family dynamics inevitably get played out and repeated with the power differentials and authority figures. And as Jan pointed out yesterday, the power differentials are always here between us, whether it's differences of age, differences of ethnicity and race, differences of power in an organization, teacher-student. I mean, there's just differences of gender identification, all the differences that we can think of. They have to do with our communications, and they're always There's always some power differential there. So in any organization, being able to speak directly to one another about what's happening and what might be a solution and what might to be able to do this kindly and skillfully. So I wanted everybody to come, and I said, come for this workshop on giving constructive feedback and receiving constructive feedback. But autocorrect put contractive feedback. Jan called me and said, what am I supposed to teach about contractive feedback? I guess we do contract when we get feedback. And I was trying to make sense of it and understand what that could mean. It was just a mistake, but it made us reflect on how we contract and what happens when we contract. And what happens is we go into that place where most of us are most of the time anyway, which is this kind of centralized self, usually located somewhere behind the eyes. And in this centralized self, everything is seen in relation to whether this self likes it or doesn't like it, or finds it safe or threatening, or, it's constantly monitoring experience from, I want more of it, actually I don't want this at all, or just a little less, or, that's the contractive place. And I think especially now at this time in our world when it seems frightening and is frightening in many ways, a frightening time certainly for immigrants, for people of color, for anybody from any marginalized group in our particular society. At a time like this when there can be so much fear, really lots of anxiety in the surround, and we can feel it. I have a friend who's teaching a retreat in India, month-long, so that's a very intensive retreat. And he said that he was feeling the fear in the field, like he could feel it, even though he's all the way in India. He could feel it coming from our country as we get closer to an election. And so what is the best approach? How do we prepare ourselves for this? And from a meditative perspective, the best approach is to begin to learn a different way of receiving feedback from our senses and from the world, which is that to notice not just the objects of our perception or the reaction to what we see from that centralized self behind our eyes, but to begin to see the space in between. And you can do it right now with your eyes open. Instead of fixating, say, on, you may be looking at me or what's above me or around me, but wherever you're looking, just look at the space in between you and whatever you're looking at. Just practice seeing the space in the room as opposed to the furniture and the people and the lights and the stuff. And you can do this all day long. You can just practice noticing the space between what you're looking at and the looker that we identify with, of course. That's me. And the more that we begin to appreciate that sort of middle zone where the space, where we can perceive the space, the more we are actually making room to not have to know all of our experience. And in that not knowing, in that willingness to tolerate the uncertainty of not knowing, in that space of awareness, that's where intuition is born. That's where intuitive wisdom comes. It's called prajna in Sanskrit and very highly valued in the Buddhist meditative, all the traditions, Panya in Pali and prajna in Sanskrit. So why shouldn't we go around lost in thought all day? Why do we practice being mindful and present and sitting here and sharing our vulnerability and being in presence together? Because it helps us not be afraid, like Alice said. But we also do this because it makes room for that other kind of knowing, that wisdom, intuitive kind of knowing, that there's no room for it when we're constantly ruminating and, obsessing and being preoccupied with our thinking minds. And since the brain secretes thoughts the way the mouth secretes saliva, we're not trying to stop that process. We're just trying to step back and create some space of loving awareness around it. Ram Dass, our friend who passed away recently, coined that phrase, loving awareness, to point to the kindness aspect, the willingness to not turn mindfulness into a self-surveillance tool for not only tracking where we're thinking and what we're doing, but commenting on it, and usually in a critical way. That's not mindfulness. That's self-surveillance. And since we're being surveilled all the time anyway, apparently, we're learning more and more about that, let's not do it to ourselves. It's already going on. Yeah, so the prajna wisdom comes from the power of, perceiving some space between, our identification, our tendency to reify and solidify what we see, our perceptions, and this centralized self back in here that we collapse into. It also has to do with the willingness to look and inquire and look deeply into what's happening in our experience. And the embodiment, in the Buddhist cosmology, there are all these figures like Kuan Yin or Avalokiteshvara, who embodies compassion, or Manjushri, who embodies wisdom. And if you've ever seen a figure depicted, and these are not deities that we worship outside of ourselves, reassuring everybody about that. They are emblems, they are reminders of qualities of consciousness that we all can access in our own hearts. And Manjushri is depicted holding a sword like this. That's not a very comforting image. I mean, a sword is dangerous, right? If you don't handle it well, it's sharp. You could hurt yourself. But that sword stands for cutting through all that thick delusions that we have about ourselves and each other. It stands for cutting through into clarity and cutting through self-deception especially. And opening to the vastness and the profoundly meaningful world of beauty that we live in when we aren't encapsulated in our, too often petty thought worlds, not necessarily that generous what's going through the mind all day long. So I really appreciate being able to share teachings with you, and that's another reason why write a book, right? I get to share whatever wisdom has come through my life experience with you this way, and it feels so much more connected and alive for me. So thank you for the opportunity to do that. And now would like to open for some conversation. And it can be about what I said, or it can be what's come up for you in your meditation, a question you might have, whatever it might be. And when you do ask a question or share an insight that you've had from how you're applying the principles of the practice in your daily life, just remember that's an act of generosity, because chances are really high that somebody else here is having the same question or the same issue, or it's and a beautiful thing that Jan also said yesterday. She said our community is made up of acts of generosity. That's what makes a community. Acts of dana, of giving. Was that right? And receiving. Why did they say it's more spiritual to give than to receive? Yeah, add, Abby.
Yes, the acts. You could.
Yeah, but
Add acts of kindness.
Yes, acts of generosity. Well, they are acts of kindness. So both, interchangeable. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I'm Brooke, and I'm a teacher, and I wonder
What kind of teacher?
elementary school,
What grade?
6th grade,
Oh, wonderful.
English. Yeah. So I give feedback every day, and why do you think it is hard for children, people to receive feedback in a way that feels constructive? It almost feels like we're afraid. It almost feels like we don't want to make mistakes. And there's some stigma around making mistakes, but how else do we learn? It's almost like it's so strange as a teacher. Like,
Do you tell the kids that?
yeah, but they don't believe me because they're so worried
Oh,
about
yeah.
not being perfect. They're so hard on themselves. And as adults, I feel like we're the same way.
We are.
So,
We are. I don't take the mic away too fast, Juan, because I wanted to ask you, what you said, or maybe I don't need to ask you, you said it, but what you said about, you answered your own question. You said they're so afraid of being imperfect or making a mistake. And, I read that piece that Jan shared with me from Alice Walker, and that's what she's talking about. And we can go all the way back to the third ancestor in Chan Buddhism in China, who said enlightenment is being without anxiety about imperfection. Now, that was centuries and centuries ago. So it's not just 6th graders and adults, it seems to be humans.
yeah, and then I was reading this, it says, refrain from blaming or shaming. Why is there shame around making mistakes? It's so, I don't know where that comes from. Because isn't that the human experience? Like, why do we feel shame when we fail?
Why do you think?
I don't know.
Do you feel it
Oh,
yourself?
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think we all do, but I don't know where it comes from. I think it comes from a deep place, but I don't know
I think
why.
it comes from a deep place. Yes. Would you answer that question? Yeah. Where does it come from, Jan? You gave the workshop.
Where?
Put the
When?
mic a little closer.
Yeah. Certainly every culture patterns differently around perfection and the glorification of the self and the sense of not being, seeing ourselves as interwoven and everyone a facet of something, not having to be everything all perfect. So I think there are cultural flavors, but I also think it's perhaps something about being dependent in childhood too, and that the real vulnerability of being small and people being powerful, trying to get you to do things you can't do yet. I mean, and so relationally vibrating with every tone of voice and every, how kids are with their mothers, feel the vibration of the voice, or a small eye lift, very, very sensitive. And so, it feels like that's potentially part of the pattern. But it's also, I think, just goes back to that idea of a self that is trying so hard in the world to not be vulnerable, to be recognized, to hide things, just kind of built into this idea of who I am and how I'm supposed to be. I think that's what goes back to pretty ancient times for human beings.
Yeah, thank you. It reminds me of my grandson with Jack, Jack's daughter's little boy, Desmond. When now he's like 15 months old, but when he was just learning to sit in a high chair and eat food, he has 2 cats in his house, and so he was eating like this. It was so cute. He was putting his head down and eating a bite, and then coming up, and then putting his head down and eating. I mean, that's how the cats eat, right? They don't have hands. And he's not that good anyway. At that point, he wasn't that good at getting his hand into his mouth. So it was just really like, I thought it was brilliant. But his parents said, being parents, this is what we do, said, use your hands. Now, they didn't say, use your hands, but they said, use your hands. And I saw the look on his face. And it was sort of like, I'm doing it wrong. He wasn't even a year old. And they weren't being mean about it. They were just trying to teach him how to eat. Like you said, parents trying to get you to do things you don't know how to do yet. And you don't necessarily want to do. You don't really have a motivation. I mean, this works great. You're not self-conscious yet about your face being covered with food. Right? I mean, we could do it. It's just that we would have to have napkins and, wipe our faces and stuff. Anyway, thank you. Does that help?
Trudy, I wanted to say about your NTR this week.
That's the little blog that goes with the newsletter. We call it NTR, which means Note to Reader.
Sorry, yes, Note to Reader. What I wanted to say was that, well, first, I'm really happy that you chose to address the topic because as somebody who writes myself, I find that the act of writing is really vulnerable. And I think that it's so normal and human to avoid those things that feel really awkward and uncomfortable, but also kind of it made me think about, obviously, my own writing practice and the things that I avoid. And I think part of what's really challenging about the idea of writing anything is you're kind of memorializing a state of being, and you're really inviting in the whole entire world to, see what you think or how you feel.
I'm going to stop.
Right? and I think that there's so much, natural fear of, unfortunately, of sort of this being judged, at least for myself. And I know I'm a good writer. I know that.
She's a poet.
And it's hard. It's a hard thing to do. But I think the only thing that your post made me really kind of tap back into is that I really wanted to have more compassion for myself for how hard it is, because it is hard. And there is such an intense level of judgment all the time about, I already know what I'm doing and not doing, like avoiding editing or avoiding whatever it is. But, and I always think like, why? When I start doing it, I really enjoy it and I love it. But it's just this inherent fear of, on some level, of failing or succeeding even, right? And then like, what does that look like, And anyway, it just brought up a lot of things that I think are really important to look at, just sort of things that we enjoy, like writing a book for you is the byproduct of things that you do enjoy and that are really important to you. And it just made me really reflect on that relationship between the way that we let ourselves be seen in the world and the ways that we stop ourselves from being seen because we can't control that,
Thank you. And you made another point at the beginning, which it wasn't so much this, but it was like you said, you write from a certain state, but of course we know that all those states are impermanent. So you write something and it's memorialized, as you said, it's out there, it's fixed, it's there. And you've moved on and you're in some whole other place and having a whole nother set of experiences and perceptions and responses. And so to be able to know that these are mind moments, but then everything is. Everything is. That's why we're here, to discover this and to study the appearance and disappearance, the birth and death of experience, the birth and death of what I call myself. Thank you.
I think it's also, I just want to say really quick that on the note of constructive feedback / reviews, like poor Sharon and the one word that stuck with her forever. And I think that, it's so hard because I think we all kind of have this inherent people-pleasing nature that we want people to be happy with our work, and that it might be its own deterrent, like the idea that, we invite that vulnerability in by allowing book reviewers or whoever it is to, say whatever it is that they need to say about our work for that, isolated period of time. And I try to always just think that the right people will read it and it will resonate with the right people. And that's really all that matters. So.
Yeah.
Don't stop writing your book. Okay.
Thank you. Gary has the mic.
Thank you as always for today. Back on the shame topic, my 3.5-year-old daughter and we started this fairly new tradition or morning tradition back in November, where I wake up and start my day with yoga, and then she also wakes up and she rolls out her sleeping bag next to my yoga mat, and then I at first would sometimes fall in my poses, and then she'd see me fall, and I would be like, this is a great teaching moment. So I would laugh intentionally and then talk about, oh, I'm just going to try again. And now sometimes I intentionally fall just so she can watch me fall and get back up again and know that that's okay. And I've seen her begin to apply this and talk about just trying again and not having any shame about it in her life as she's watching me. I think that's the connection. At least
that's beautiful.
My ego wants to believe that.
That's beautiful.
But and there's a part of me that, because there's this story in our culture about how kids see their parents as perfect until they're older, and part of me is scared, like, oh my God, she's learning too young that I'm not perfect. Anyway, that's not.
You're still a lot bigger than she is.
Yeah, there you go. But anyway, it's been a really cool way for her to know and kind of learn that falling is totally expected and fine.
Yeah, that's beautiful. My first teacher was a Korean Zen master I've talked about here named Daesan Sanim, and he used to always say that the practice of Zen, the whole practice he called it try, try, try. Try, fall down 100 times, get up 101 times. That was his teaching, or part of it. So that's beautiful. Joan.
I just wanted to say that Jack said something once that I remembered about vulnerability, and because I had to wrap it around my mind a while, that it's our vulnerability that we actually depend upon.
That was a quote.
In life.
Yeah, he was quoting, yeah.
Yeah, who's he quoting?
I forget who he was quoting, but he was quoting
that we depend
somebody.
Upon. Yeah.
What does that mean to you? I'd like to know what that means to you, like why that struck you. Maxine, will you pass? Yeah.
Yeah. I guess because I've always struggled with my vulnerabilities and in a way felt not okay about my needs.
We feel like it's somehow a mistake.
Yeah. And so when he said that, then it helped me realize, I mean, it was, you actually depend on vulnerability to be in this world. And so it took away a little bit of the, at least cognitively, the, I guess, maybe shame involved in having needs.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah.
This is probably a little bit like what Gary was talking about. I grew up where I felt and I was judged. Sure, sorry. Where I was predominantly judged. I had a smarter, prettier older sister. I was compared a lot. And I didn't realize how much of my life, and through therapy, etc., that I depended on what other people thought of me, that was my yardstick of how I could look at myself. And hence, if there was a mistake, yes, there was my shame, but my shame was even deeper if I thought it got disapproval from you. And it actually took me away from a path that I thought I was going to go on, but this was a path that is always critical. You're either good or you're not. That's it. And then because of this practice, because of my meditation and because of my Zen, etc., I got to see the shame in myself, and I got to let that go, cut myself some slack. And when I started to cut myself some slack, all that judgment that I thought I was getting just softened. A lot of, was up here, but once
Surprise,
again, like
surprise.
Jen said,
Yeah.
or you did, the raised eyebrow, oh my God, I'm being judged down to the world, I'm in hell now, And there was so much freedom to it, and I actually had to find something to even counter that. So, I use my improv mindfulness, because in improv, there are no mistakes. So it's such a lovely muscle to just practice with and go. So now when I make a mistake, I'm the only one, unless I've hurt somebody, of course, but I'm the only one that I need to apologize to, probably about 60% of the time. The rest I will apologize to you, and I can roll my eyes out loud. I mean, I've got that Shapiro tongue, and it can come out. And I get to apologize, but then it stops. If I sit in the shame of it, nothing, because I do, nothing moves forward, and it's just down a rabbit hole until I can pick up this practice, because this practice says it all. It's not about that I'm going to not make the mistakes. It's the coming back.
And it's also the willingness to feel what you're feeling fully,
Yes.
to not try to ward it off or deny
Right.
it or suppress it, but to just feel it with the understanding this too is a mind moment. This too will pass. This too can be, I can feel this, and it's not all of who I am.
It's been, and that is liberating.
Yeah.
The willingness, which I think is grace, that came to just, boy, you feel like shit right now because of what you did or that look you gave. Now just feel it, and now what can you do? Instead of, I'm going in the hole, I'm going to read covers, whatever it is. Those days are long gone. And I'm grateful for that.
Yeah,
That's all.
thank you.
Still there.
The poetic tradition is really a major part of my spiritual life, and I feel like it really honors our fragility and our humanness in a way that many spiritual paths do not. And I just want to make an offering of David White has a poem called Faces of Braga, and it's about celebrating our imperfections. It's such a beautiful statement of our humanity, and he has a CD called The Poetry of Self-Compassion. And it's so beautiful when he talks about just accepting our limp and going, this is my limp, as opposed to this idea that we're supposed to be perfect like our Father in heaven is perfect from Christianity. And, just going, life's a school, and just having a different perspective on what we're doing here, which is learning.
That's beautiful, yes. Yes. And the Manjushri sword that cuts through, delusion and self-deception. And I think what I was trying to talk about in a way is making room for learning. That kind of intuitive wisdom, it's learning. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so if we see life as a school, and I love words, and I write a lot for a living, and taking the word mistake, and taking the miss out of mistake, you have take one, take two, take three.
Oh, that's good. Thank you, Bill.
I want to go back, if I can, to the shame and blame conversation quickly, because I heard Jan explain where it comes from, but I'm not sure if I heard a suggestion on how we kind of deal with it. So let me give an example. Yesterday I was having a conversation with my daughter. My wife was sitting in the car, and my daughter was asking what we're going to do for her birthday, and I was asking her what she'd like to do, how she's feeling, does she want to have some friends? And my wife interrupted and said, I have to go, we have to go. And so my daughter and I looked at each other, we smiled and said, we'll talk about it later. And I kind of took a breath in the car, and we drove off. We had an appointment. And I said, I turned to my wife, I said, I just want you to know that it makes me close off. It makes me feel a little further from you when you use such harsh tone. And, there's no, and I literally said, I'm not trying to blame you for anything. I'm saying that's the way I react. So I just wanted to share that. And the response was, well, we're late and we had to go. And I hear you and I'm sorry, but and I was like, wow, this is it's so hard to share something. And I didn't know if you have a suggestion in a better way to share something.
Yes. Do you want to come sit up here?
I just feel it's empathy with both of you and all of you because the burden of making sure we're on time is one of the most terrible stresses of our lives, for sure, and that deep compassion for that, too. I think that one of the things that really supports relational opening is, it is what you're saying, but it's also, when I think of the Buddha's suggestions of true, timely, beneficial, kind, spoken with a heart of compassion as wise speech. So is it timely? And when it's brought up, is it kind? Is it true? You were focusing on what's true for you, but then there are all these other kind of questions, timely, beneficial. And I also think having some kinds of relational practices with each other of how to talk and receive feedback and how to kind of hear from both sides, having a process of some kind that works in which each of you can share your truth. May have to wait for a while to be able to do that, but practicing that together is really helpful. That's, so that there's a shared intention that we each are going to speak our truth and listen deeply to each other. So it's speaking and listening deeply that feels like a simple practice, but takes practice together and a shared intention and practice.
And it's easy to avoid doing that
Yeah.
together.
I just
Yeah.
see this whole kind of rooting the self. We're trying so hard to be permanent in an impermanent world, changing world. We're trying to hold on to things that can't be held on to. There's this deep Buddhist compassion for this human condition and the difficulties. I'm in this place and you're in this place, and we're in totally different vision worlds, This is struggling with change, struggling with unsatisfactoriness, So sort of that kind of deep compassion that's in the noble truths of that feels like the radical kind of inquiry together, alone internally and together, that we're in these worlds.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I just looked at the time, you guys. We need to sit for a minute. Thank you, Jan. Great question and great topic and great morning. Thank you, everybody. So at the end of a period of study and practice together, we express our gratitude and appreciation for the privilege, the luxury of being able to spend time this way, the freedom to come together and practice meditating and learning how to bring the teachings into our actual lived, embodied experience of life. And we express this gratitude and appreciation for the goodness, whatever benefit has come from doing this together. We send it, we offer it freely to all beings everywhere, without exception. May we and all beings grow in humility and confidence to listen deeply to each other and find the shared intention to get along and I want to just read a very brief poem from Gwendolyn Brooks. Say to them, say to the downkeepers, the sun slappers, the self-soilers, the harmony hushers, even if you're not ready for day, it can't always be night. You will be right, for that's the hard home run. Live not for battles won, live not for the end of the song. Live in the along. So thank you, everybody. I'm sorry we went a little over time. The clock here says 12:38, so we really went over time. Sorry if you had somewhere to be. It's 12:38, and I just want to remind you there is an offering bowl. I think now that you have to register because of the space constraints that we have here, and we're having 2 groups, and now that you need to do that, you may have already offered your dana, but if you haven't, please do, because that is how you support the center, the teacher, and the teachings. So thank you, everybody, and I will see you next week.